Hey everyone, I'm Supriya, but people also know me as Sup. I'm a creative lead at the Eora Sydney-based animation studio Never Sit Still. It's truly an honour being here today as part of such a hectic lineup, so thank you again, Captain Jimmy. I'd like to begin today by acknowledging the Wurundjeri people, traditional custodians of the land on which we're gathered, and to pay my respects to elders past and present. I extend that respect to any Aboriginal or Torres Strait Islander people here today. So I've been working at Never Sit Still for just under 2 years now. But before then, I ping-ponged all over the place, bouncing from full-time to freelance, back to full-time, working across everyone from production studios to agencies and the occasional broadcaster. I've worked across all industries and been part of teams big and small, working on everything from 6-second social ads to 6-minute corporate explainers. But I didn't start off that way, so let's rewind. The year is 2005. I have just turned 12, and for the next 3 years, I'm going to log pretty much everything I make onto DeviantArt. Hopefully some of you fellow millennials can relate, growing up in the internet age and posting all the most personal parts of yourself online for the world to see, and then forgetting your password so you can't get any of it taken down. Well, this is mine, and the reason I'm showing you this is firstly to break the ice, so please enjoy the secondhand embarrassment, and secondly, it's to explain what I do at its core, because I haven't really changed all that much. Back then, I was all about experimentation. I was just playing with whatever mediums I could get my hands on, trying to figure out which one would click for me. Something that I could devote 10,000 hours to and become a famous artist like the ones that I admired. As you can see, I never really found my medium. Nothing clicked like that, and ultimately I realized that what I really liked, something that's still true to this day, is just making, experimenting, and learning. My most cringe is probably this. At 14, I had decided that I was old enough now to not need reference imagery, so I would freehand all of my portraits in the same 3/4 pose. This was called the Wallachian Princess. Don't ask me why, I have no idea. I entered it into an online competition on DeviantArt and I won a 6-month premium subscription for Most Improved. How cool. But no, honestly, I was chuffed. Somehow, through all the random crap I was posting over that 3-year period, it was immensely validating that some internet strangers could actually see improvement in my gallery, and especially because I didn't have any sort of distinct style or aesthetic. So it was a huge deal to me. It was a nice reminder in those early stages that we are all works in progress. That was the very first version of me. You can think of her like an animatic, a sign of things to come. Before I launch into all the other whips, here is my latest render. Thanks. So my first real work in progress after the animatic was my time in university, which was a real struggle. If you couldn't tell from the copious amounts of time I was spending on DeviantArt, I was not the most academic kid. My art teacher saw me dragging my feet in my final year and told me exactly which degree to apply for, which is how I ended up in a Bachelor of Design in Visual Communications without actually knowing anything about design. Graphic design, it turns out, is really freaking hard. Layouts, typefaces, logos, it was just not my wheelhouse. Not only did I have no concept of what was good or bad, I was a maximalist, learning design in an era of postmodern, Scandi minimalism. Everything in uni was stripped back and clean. But editorial layouts told me no story. Typefaces did not make me think about the world. And logos did not spark joy. Yet. While there, I learnt that good design was subtle and unobtrusive. Its core objective was to clearly communicate through a less is more ethos. To me, though, it all just looked boring. I would make everything illustrative because that was expression. That communicated something complex. My first logo, which we had to make from our initials, I turned into a snake. Not sure what I was trying to communicate there, but had tone. I also hand-rendered an entire typeface based on the Mexican Day of the Dead, and it looked like something from DeFont. Needless to say, I failed that entire subject. So yeah, university was an ego-destroying experience, but while there I learned so much about how to actually function as a designer. Most importantly, your first whip, your first idea, your first version of yourself, it is never the best, but it's something you can improve on through the design thinking principles of reflection, iteration, and revision. So I did eventually catch on to the nuances of good design, but in my third year, none of that mattered anymore because I had met the love of my life. I know it gets a lot of hate, especially at Node, but it was truly the gateway drug for most of us getting into motion design, right? For me, it was my way out of minimal design hell and into animation heaven. With the added dimension of time and music, I was engrossed. Finally, something had clicked. This was one of the first animation assignments I did in uni on the theme of concealing and revealing. And this was my first typeface again, so it was pretty clear which direction I was going in. So, who's ready to learn After Effects? I'm joking, I won't make you sit through that. But for real, we've looked at my animatic and whip one. It's time for the real case study. I'm going to go through some of my individual transform properties for version 2. In 2014, I was hired for my first position by Mel Pregasson, who was creative director at a small studio. You may recognize her from Node 2017. Mel was young, she was an excellent mentor, and also a woman of color. Being able to see myself reflected in a creative leadership position so early on in my career was hugely significant. It gave me hope that I was in an industry that valued diversity and inclusion, with pathways for people that look like me. As a first-gen Indian Australian, I didn't have any role models growing up, especially within the Australian art or design industry that looked like me. So being hired by Mel truly made me feel seen. Unfortunately, in the almost 10 years that I have been bouncing around the motion design industry, Mel is still the only woman of color that I have personally come across in a creative leadership position. So while things definitely seem like they are moving in the right direction, our industry is also very much a work in progress too. It's important to be conscious of the culture that we're creating because diversity in race, religion, gender, and sexuality bring unique perspectives and inspiration into our work, which ultimately make it a richer tapestry. So in this whip, I quickly realized that if I wanted my position to move up on the y-axis, I would need to learn how to communicate like Mel. And I don't just mean talking about the work, but rather the interpersonal skills that allow you to shake off the awkwardness of meeting new people. 40 hours of face-to-face contact with new colleagues was both exciting and daunting. When someone would ask me what I did on the weekend, my mind would go completely blank. So I had a lot of work to do. I started going to little industry events as a wee junior, and not only was it a great opportunity for me to just get comfortable in my own skin, but I met so many people through them, especially freelancers. It seemed like without the warm embrace of a full-time role, it was their way of staying connected and feeling a sense of community. And by going to those events, I slowly became part of that community as well. If the walls of your home office are starting to close in on you, I can't recommend enough that you stay connected and put yourself out there. Join a Slack group, talk to a bunch of strangers tonight. We are so fortunate that we work in such a tight-knit community. But if you aren't here to make friends, just know that every single job I've had after that first role, whether it was full-time or freelance, I got through someone I met in the crowded front room of Knox Street Bar, where Loop to Loop would happen every 2 months in Sydney. All word of mouth through many people I am still friends with to this day. So while the focus of the last whip was to learn how to communicate and make connections, it was all done with the goal of moving up and going freelance myself, which is something I did in 2016. I was a little nervous diving into the freelancer pool because I hadn't really been working for very long, but the water wasn't dark and murky. I had an opacity of 0% because of all the people I had met at those events who had told me of their experiences. Having a mentor was also invaluable, and Mel perfectly prepped me for the variety of studios, jobs, and people that I would encounter. I hit the ground running, and it was liberating to begin with. The constant flux made life very exciting. I didn't really know where I fit into the industry at this point, so I kept an open mind and I would say yes to everything. It was a great way of figuring out what I liked doing and was actually good at, what kind of jobs I liked, what kind of companies I preferred working for. I was learning heaps and getting a more holistic view of the industry. So, all in all, version 3 was super productive and had greatly improved from the previous whip. Unfortunately, 3 years into freelancing, things changed course and I found myself in a bit of a downward spiral. I was burnt out, I was no longer being challenged, and I was creatively unfulfilled. So how did I get there? Well, one reason was that even though I knew what jobs were right for me and which ones were not, I was still saying yes to everything to maintain a good reputation. I also had this feeling that I constantly needed to earn my day rate. And as a result, I swung between two extremes of being either 110% productive when I was booked to completely burning out from the sheer exertion every 15 months. That idea of earning my rate placed a huge burden of responsibility on my shoulders. I would think about all that I should and could do in 8 hours to make it worth people's money. It's something I notice in other freelancers and co-workers all the time. Once you start living in fantasy land of shoulds and coulds, no matter how much you actually achieve in 8 hours, it will never feel like enough. Take, for example, you get stuck on something technical and you spend hours problem solving and not actually producing work. It can feel like a waste of a day, right? But no, that is all part of the job. Problem solving and learning is an inherent part of all technical roles. It took me a while to realize that I get paid for 8 hours to do as much as I can do in 8 hours, not how much I could do. I was also creatively unfulfilled because I kept getting hired to do jobs that I had done a million times before. And so I wasn't really learning anything anymore. The recommended solution is always to upskill. But saying yes all the time when I was constantly booked, working at 110% when I was constantly drained, and so I just did not have the time or energy to upskill. I was making nothing that showed clients what kind of work I actually wanted to do. And this is when I started to think, why did I turn my hobby into my career? Things were clearly not going well, and you would think that at this point I would reach some sort of epiphany and turn things around, but that would have been too easy. I didn't actually realize how bad things had gotten, because one thing was doing an excellent job of masking all my dissatisfaction: my ego. During this period, I had completely lost sight of my goals. Freelancing was the last stop on my straight and narrow path, and I hadn't stopped to think about where I wanted to go from there. But having a goal is so important because it focuses your efforts and it gives you a framework on what areas need improvement. For me, the absence of a goal left my ego completely unchecked. I had nothing to measure myself against, nothing looming over me telling me I still needed to get better at X, Y, and Z. So the natural conclusion was, I'm amazing. I was making it rain. I had thank you emails piling up in my inbox. I'd get warm fuzzies when people would recommend me. My calendar was full. And what other cool job lets you take 3-month-long vacations? So my ego was having a blast. Like, all of these things became a source of pride for me, and they really got tied into how I felt about myself. But basing your self-worth around how much money you're making or how much you're booked is very dangerous, which is something I found out in 2019, because right before the general election, all the freelance jobs in Sydney seemed to dry up. It was like everyone was holding their breath and clutching their purse strings, just waiting to see what the economic future would look like. It was the perfect storm, because when 2 weeks of no work turned into 2 months of unemployment, my bubble finally burst. All the self-doubt came flooding back in, and I was convinced I wasn't getting any work because my work was shit. So this whip had gone way off course, and it was time to version up by going back to those classic design thinking principles of reflection, iteration, and revision. If you're unhappy with where you are, it's never too late to change course. It's really unfortunate that it took a long period of unemployment to snap me out of it. I reflected that I was deeply dissatisfied with the quality of work that I was producing, and that my ego had me focusing on superficial things that I knew would not actually make me happy. I never got into this line of work for the money. It was for the love of creating art, like most of you guys here. So somehow I'd gotten sucked into the rat race, and I didn't understand why. So how did I iterate? I gave myself boundaries. I gave myself a goal as well. And I got back to my core values. By making boundaries, I mean I stopped my compulsive yes saying and I started saying no. No to jobs that didn't challenge me, no to companies I didn't want to work for, and no to tasks that were outside my area of expertise. So no, I will not edit your live action music video. But most importantly, no to overtime. If I could go back in time, instead of passively saying yes to whatever fell into my lap, I would actively pursue the jobs that I wanted. So learn from my mistakes and reach out to the studios that you love and want to work for. If you're struggling to figure out what your goals are, the very act of seeking out projects will help you figure out and narrow down where you want to be. In those 2 months of unemployment, when I was spiraling, I did eventually get my shit together, and I started making the most of my free time. I hadn't made anything for myself in months, if not years at this point, so I just had to remind myself that I did used to enjoy doing this stuff once upon a time, and I forced myself to put pen tool to artboard every day and see what would happen. Somewhere in this weird stream of conscious doodling that I was doing, I realized that I wanted to get better at drawing and illustration. So I rendered a couple of those doodles. I hadn't done a character rig in a while, so I whipped out some plugins and made this girl. I started a classic alphabet thing and made it to the letter C. I did a few self-portraits, one of which I opened up Flash and tried to do some blobby cell stuff, which was incredibly fun, but like mind-boggling, honestly. So props to anyone that does that. So. But yeah, things were back on track. I was making, experimenting, and learning again. I made an Insta dedicated to my side projects, not my paid work, so people would be able to see what kind of work I enjoyed doing, and also just as an outlet for all my creative traffic. And somehow, through my Insta, I actually got my first illustration job, which was for Envato. It was an odd little job. They were about to launch a stock illustration website and they needed fodder to fill the site. But honestly, I was just psyched that I was getting paid to draw anything, so it was cool. The theme was technology, and they wanted me to create 5 illustrations. The budget was slim, and in my new quest to not overextend myself and have a healthier work-life balance, efficiency was the name of the game. I divided up the project fee and calculated that I would have 6 hours for each one, from brainstorming to delivery. I'd start off with my rough scribbles. Thankfully, the client was awesome and not in the slightest bit terrified by these. They would choose 5 from the 7, and then I would render them in the same grayscale palette. And then I would just batch recolor them in Illustrator. They hired me to do another 5 or 6 kits in that year, and it really just broke me out of my rut. These 2 were my favorite from the job. I had the process down, so I was able to be a bit more elaborate with perspectives, level of detail. But yeah, I really milked those 6 hours. In my quest to only do jobs that would challenge me, I also stumbled into compositing. It was exactly what I needed to sink my teeth into, something detail-oriented and technical. Through deconstructing other people's art and rebuilding it for animation, I learned so much about different art styles, about composition, lighting, 3D. I did it for a few months on back-to-back projects, and then I got a bit antsy because I hadn't actually designed or animated anything myself in months. The curse of being spread thin as an all-rounder. For the longest time, I actually viewed being an all-rounder as a negative thing. I think it was definitely a complex that I had developed from idolizing those famous artists as a kid, people that had their own distinct, recognizable style. It's really easy to fall into that trap these days as well when you look at social media, and it feels like the people who make it, the ones that have thousands of followers, are likewise those with a unique aesthetic. There was a real sense that by dabbling in design, illustration, animation, and compositing, that I was only going to be mediocre at them all instead of really excelling in one. But on reflection of this whip, I have learnt to be grateful for my broad skill set, because it's really given me a big picture understanding of all of these skills and how they can be combined. I figured my actual superpower now was being an expert creative problem solver, which is what landed me a job at Never Sit Still in 2021. So this is the most recent whip, so you can all relax now. I'll take you through some of what I do now as creative lead and run you through a project before wrapping up. As a creative lead, my job consists of many things that I didn't get to do while working solo. I present to client. I had to learn how to make a deck. I do a lot more conceptual development these days. I curate, I art direct, I line produce the internal creative team, I give feedback, and I provide mentorship. If you remember back to my uni days, I mentioned how logos did not spark joy. Well, luckily that had changed over the years, because the first job I led was the motion identity for Binge, and 90% of this job was a logo resolve. We're working with the agency Tinkerbell, who were tasked with the refresh, and they gave us these 2 elements, the logo and a new framing device. They explained to us that their past motion identities, which were dynamic and a beautifully rendered cloth sim, were just conceptually not hitting the mark anymore, and they wanted this new identity to also vibe with a younger audience. We started with R&D, which was an entirely foreign concept to me before working at Never Sit Still. As a freelancer, I was always a hired gun. I was always working to budgetary or time constraints, and so I was never really given the opportunity to do heaps of exploration like this, so it was incredible. Everyone in the studio, from juniors to seniors, were encouraged to jump on board and just play around with the elements and see what cool stuff we could come up with. These are just a few selects from a more comprehensive 40-page deck where we had synthesized the tests into 4 core concepts. In classic client fashion, they kind of chose one concept and then they really just chose these 2 tests, which were their favorite and part of completely different concepts. So it was equal parts helpful and confusing. But we were starting to understand what the client was into, and honestly, these did become the seeds for our project. We moved into style frames and storyboarding. Each one of these style frames was accompanied by a different storyboard and an outline of the concept. In hindsight, doing 6 was probably overkill, but we were really just after the client to definitively pick one, and they did, which was the top right. This route was all about using the logo itself as a gateway. The logo would come to life in 3D, and then the camera would dive into it through a spectacular tunnel that represented the breadth and diversity of their content on the platform. We knew it would be difficult for the client to kind of visualize that 3D rotation, so we included a bit of a play blast. No matter which way the cube rotated, it would always be a rhombus, which to a 2D brain like me, I was like, what? How'd you make that? Like, how do you model something like that? But I've realized now it's basically just like the 3D equivalent of After Effects CC slant. We moved into production, and the 3D team, did what they did do best, which was just, do awesome shit. They explored how the forever rhombus, as we like to call it, could work in motion and work in cut downs. Meanwhile, I jumped onto the comp and started piecing everything together. Everything was colored in After Effects because the agency was still finessing the colors, and every week we would get a new final gradient. We needed absolute control, and as you can see down the bottom, each face of the rhombus was rendered from 3D as a separate pass, and then we brought them into After Effects, and using set mats, we isolated the intersecting shapes and colored everything manually using a gradient overlay, which allowed us to not really keyframe anything because it mapped to the alpha, which was super handy. The tunnel was entirely created in After Effects 3D. I used some basic expressions to create this accordion rig in Z-Space, so as the layers would fan back, the camera would fly straight through the middle and out the other end. All the layers were live linked to the Illustrator file, which would auto-update when I made changes, and it was just, once again, built this way so that it was as editable as possible in case the client had feedback. And boy, did they have feedback. So this was our first full whip. Everything had gone smoothly up until this point, and we were feeling really good about it. The agency loved it, and the client liked the animation, but they absolutely hated what we had done to their palette, which was fair enough because I had taken a lot of liberties with their palette. You know, they gave us a gradient, and I pulled out a lot of solid colors that did not exist prior. But, you know, they told us to push it, and so we pushed it. But yeah, they were reining us back in. This is what they wanted. No contrasting blocks, no solid colors, no segments at all in the tunnel. We weren't really convinced internally that it was the way to go because it's just a bit difficult to pass what's going on. It gets a bit washed out. It just lacks definition. And it would have been really, really easy at this point to just give the client what they wanted. But the agency was also on our side, so we pushed back. This is the cliff notes of what happened over the next 2 months. The tunnel dominated all of our conversations, and we showed them iteration after iteration, often in motion. I explained countless times that what makes something visually vibrant and interesting is contrast, pure and simple. I learned a new art form during this process, the art of persuasion, my least favorite tool in the kit, but it paid off in the end. This is what we finally settled on, albeit with a bit less orange. And here is the final graphics package. There's no sound, by the way. Cheers. You can probably tell from all the agonizing about who I am and what my value is that I have had a severe case of imposter syndrome for most of my career. I'm definitely my own #1 critic, and it's been a difficult pattern to break out of. The thing to take away for anyone in a similar position is that we are all works in progress, and not to be so hard on yourself. All the different skills that you do, the different pathways that you've switched between, They all add up to who you are now. I have redefined my idea of success countless times and have been left with this. The only thing that matters is to be better every day and strive to win most improved. Thank you.